Miller Industries, the world leader in towing and recovery equipment.
I didn't want to build a car carrier.
You didn't?
Did not.
No.
And who convinced you?
Welcome to the 50th year anniversary of Century Wreckers, a series highlighting the stories behind some of the most influential products that revolutionized the towing and recovering industry and the people who made it happen. In this episode, we hear John Hawkins, Geoff Russell, Ralph McConnell, and Gerry Holmes recount stories from the last 50 years.
The opening would be this segment that we're filming this morning with you, because being the founding father of Century Wrecker, we feel it's very important, first of all, having you to be here, and then bringing what got you to start Century. You know, we know Dad sold the company in '72. We believe that the building of the 475 at the Ernest Holmes Company was your drive to take it from mechanical wreckers to hydraulic wreckers, and that the Dover Corporation felt that it had taken longer than what it should to bring the 475 to market.
Well, they were too invested in the 404 tooling, the way I remember it, too, and they weren't interested in moving to hydraulics at that point in time. That's the way I recall.
So thereupon you took it upon yourself to go out and start Century Wrecker, fund it. We know the 402 was your first vision in the design and changing what was the 475, some of its maybe shortfalls with the winches being up in the rear window and a high center of gravity.
We built a hydraulic wrecker that did slew left and right, but I don't think it was the 475.
Okay.
I do remember a hydraulic wrecker that slewed because I turned it over.
I thought Bill, what was it? Ted Thomason was with you at that time when that happened, if I'm not
really?
mistaken.
Well,
Yeah.
I don't remember who was with me, but that was a long time ago.
But so the vision of, the Century 402 was that design, lower center of gravity. In the features, you had the extendable, the bolt-on jib, and Century was founded off of the 402.
Correct.
And as I mentioned with you, you've really had kind of 5 critical moves in creating the industry, basically where it is: the 402, the 1030, which was the first big hydraulic wrecker.
Sure.
The Formula One, which came in 1983 as the first wheel lift really in the American market, other than, we have the Canadians with the wheel snatcher that was there also. And then the project that Ralph worked on, which was the 17-foot aluminum car carrier and that 10.5 degree load angle that you absolutely pressed to make happen. And then the last thing under your guard was probably, and I forgot about this, was the SDU and that vision that you had with that hydraulic underlift fitting on the back of our heavy-duty product line and coming to market with it in 1986.
SDU, you mean, what do we call that?
Super Duty Underlift.
Okay. All right, that had escaped me.
Yeah. Well, let me hear this. Hold on a sec.
Well, what is this?
So that is the Freightliner that we did. Who was our freight? Duckett's. Mr. Duckett out of
St. Louis.
No, he was out of Missouri, lower down, all the way down in the corner. And that was the 1040 that we had with that Von Cannon and Ralph worked on that project to bring the SDU, which is
the
your
underlift.
First, the underlift. Now that's at the Choo Choo. He stole a lot of stuff, Gerry, when you left. Ralph did, and put it in that
I
pocket.
haven't left yet, but it was in my box.
So, there's I think that, the Geoff was around at the very beginning. Myself, Ralph came on with that group that was Lorraine. What we want to do is kind of get you to, or we can help you come along with that beginning, from the Ernest Holmes Company. And Dad sold, I think, the business in '72.
think it was, yes.
Yeah. So it was that 2 years that you stayed on board with them before leaving.
Yes. Actually, it's about a year and a half.
Yeah. And if I'm not mistaken, you first called the company the Gerald Holmes Company.
Gerald Holmes Corporation.
Corporation.
Yes.
And I think the people of Dover weren't very happy with you.
No, they weren't happy with that. The fact is, we made a plaque, the original plaque on number 1, which is, I think, the 402 that we're talking about, the original 402.
Yes, sir.
Had a plaque on it that said manufactured by Gerald Holmes and Associates. And that came off and was replaced by a different plaque that didn't have my name on it. And they weren't pleased with the name of the company being called.
So if I'm not mistaken, there was a very charming young lady that came up with the name Century.
That was my wife.
That was your wife.
That's what he's getting at.
Oh, well, okay.
So do you know why or how she selected that?
Well, it had to do with the age of I don't know, there were 4 or 5 of us that had been in the business about 20 years through the Holmes Company and maybe a competitor that would comprise Century Corporation. And that's how that was really the substance of it, is the seniority of the people that started the company.
So as you were looking at that change from the mechanical side, which had been the Ernest Holmes backboard since 1912, and the current product line with the 440 through the 750, as you saw the vision to step into hydraulics, what kind of drove you with that vision? Different than what was already offered in the mechanical side?
Well, there were obvious advantages.
Right.
For it. You could have it hydraulic outriggers, or you could have a hydraulic extended boom. It was quiet by comparison. And,
I would have missed that one on that side, because that's true.
It's simple to operate. You didn't have any clashing of gears when you shifted.
The Holmes product line in that mechanical had tremendous advantages from the 480 through the 850 with the splitting of the booms and being able to tie off to the dead man, but all of that took a lot of work and rigging in order to make that piece of equipment successful. The other thing is that once you put it in that position, that's the position it stayed at, because you couldn't hydraulically extend or raise the boom or reposition something without manually getting up there and cranking with it.
That's true.
And the crank would
true.
kill you.
The boom position had to be preset. Because once it was under load, you couldn't change it with a manual crank.
Though those in the field, I know one particularly that had tried to do that and suffered dramatically. It was an unhealthy event for her. So as that transition came from that mechanical time when you were at the Ernest Holmes Company, and with that first hydraulic with the 475, you also kind of changed away from a foundation to the Holmes Company, which was their gear-driven winch, and went to the first time for a vendor supplying you a hydraulic winch out of that Oklahoma market with Ramsey.
That's very true. Yes, the Holmes Company traditionally had always manufactured all of their own transmissions and winch mechanisms, basically out of necessity, because when the Holmes Company started, those commercial type winches were not in existence. So my grandfather had to devise spur gear driven substitutes for today we take for granted, and today is mostly worm gear driven. So that was started out of necessity.
And I think that advantage of those early Holmes winches was the fact that as they gained layers of cable, their capacity really didn't diminish because of the fact that that gear was driven on the outside of the drum.
Well, that's not really true because the amount of torque, depending upon how close the actual cable that had the load on it was to the output shaft of the transmission. The size of the drum only was control the amount of cable that you could carry on it.
Okay.
Wasn't the Holmes winch rated at the top of layer? If it was a 30 ton, it was on the top layer, which is different than the Ramsey winch because it's based on the bottom layer.
Correct.
And decreases as it goes.
But they were all large drums.
Yes.
So you didn't have very many layers of cable on the drum.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the transmission that was done in that Holmes line from the 480 up to the 750 was all the same transmission.
That's true.
Yeah. It wasn't until the birth of the Holmes 850, which originally was a 30,000 pound unit and then went to 40,000, that transmission itself was designed specifically for it.
Well, that was one of a kind, the 850 thing, yeah.
It's kind of like the M100 today, the old Holmes 850. So, I don't know, Geoff. You know, you and I first met in 1977. We were introduced to each other by Sonny Griffin, and I think Sonny played an absolute critical part, you know, in for Gerry and the emergence of the Century product.
You know, I met Gerry in June of 1977 at the GM Proving Grounds in Milford, Michigan.
Okay.
You and Harold Carr from the Holmes Company.
Oh, wow.
And
That was that other figure.
three or 4 weeks later, I'd met Sonny in Wisconsin. First time I'd ever met him, Wisconsin Dells, for a tow show there. And September the 7th, I started to work with Gerry. And in fact, driving the 1030 to St. Louis for
I'm glad you all can still remember this stuff.
So that was the introduction of the 1030 at the TBA show in St. Louis.
You know, and so from 74 until 78, basically Century Wrecker was the 402 as an 8-ton unit that was placed either on a Chevy, a Ford, or a Dodge cab and chassis.
Yeah. We also had a 401, which was the same wrecker with one winch.
That's true. Well, from the 402, we did have the 401, and then we came out with the Super 6 for an entry level with no extendable boom on there to keep the dollars down on that. And then you all came up with the 442 XL, which is what went to the Olympics in 1980. But I can remember back then that the production of Century Wrecker in its highlight in that 77, 78, and 79 era was 100 units a month. And there was 10 zone reps, and each zone rep got 10 wreckers. You recall that? I do.
No.
In the month of July in 1977, you built 9 small wreckers in Ottawa.
My goodness.
And most of that stuff, you had a subcontractor that was manufacturing the components.
Yes.
And
Mr. Copeland.
Copeland's Incorporated.
Copeland's. And it was really, Ottawa was really an assembly shop.
That's true. That is very true.
So when you went out and took on this challenge of starting this new manufacturing facility, how did you fund it?
How did I what?
Fund it.
Gerry, let me add something here. After you sold the company, that Christmas after you left, we had a Christmas get together for the office guys down at Michael's on Brainerd Road. And we were there, and you and Betsy came in, and Randy Nicola and Von Cannon and I were sitting at a table, and you got a drink, and you came over and sat down with us and started talking. And for some reason, you started talking about, okay, the history of how you got started with Century and how you had inherited money from your grandmother and how you divided that money up so you would have money in the bank and then money to use to start the company. Do you remember that story? I can remember the story, but I can't remember the amount of money that you had that you inherited.
My grandmother, on my father's side, my grandmother Holmes, when she died, she left me and my two brothers, the three of us, $300,000 each.
Okay.
So my $300,000 was what I took half of that to start Century Record. It didn't come out all at once. It came in as needed when we started the company. I think originally it was capitalized on $10,000.
I think originally, Jerry, your offices were above a store on Rossville Boulevard. Is that?
Well, yes, it was. Our first office was a two-room office out on Howard Street in Rossville Boulevard. It was a building that a friend of mine owned together out there. We owned 3 buildings, kind of crappy buildings they were, and still are, on Howard Street. And so I rented one for myself and had 2 rooms, showing 6 people here.
But that was effectively right around the corner from the Holmes Company.
Well, it was within probably 3/4 of a mile.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can recognize a few people from when I started.
I recognize them all except the one standing right behind me.
So that's Sonny in the middle?
Yeah.
Sonny Griffin? Bill on the right, you on the left?
Yes.
Jerry
And Harold
Pace.
Carr?
It's
Jerry Pace,
Jerry Pace in the back.
behind Bill, and I see Mervyn Griffin behind Sonny, but I don't know who the person is behind me.
Okay.
God.
When was it that you made the move to Ottawa?
Well, it wasn't long. We were only in that Rossville office a short time because we had pretty much conceived what became the 402 at the time. And in fact, we had already built the first prototype, Copeland. We took him the drawings and he hand built the first 402, and the original pictures were taken right out there on Howard Street of that first wrecker. Then we quickly realized that we needed a place of our own to put these things together. Assembly, we needed an assembly point because we didn't intend to actually produce the parts at that time. So we were going to continue to subcontract components and become assembly operation. So that's when we found the place in Ooltewah, and at that time I think there were only 7,000 square feet in that old pole barn building out there on 10 acres.
And downtown Chattanooga to downtown Ottawa was like, how would you want to say it, out in the sticks?
Yes.
Was it a financial investment?
There was an Esso station down on the corner, and then there was a diner. And I think those were the only 2 buildings I remember out there.
Yeah, the Cream House.
So moving out there to Ottawa is 76?
That's about right.
And at that point in time, you were just looking at Copeland supplying you the sheets and the booms and the deck plates and all of that, and then it would be a process of bringing all those together to build the 402s.
Yeah, we had we were buying winches directly from Ramsey, and the cylinders were being built by
Texas Hydraulics.
Texas, is it? Yeah, and
Texas
they were
Hydraulics.
shipped direct to us.
Yeah.
And started out as an assembly operation. We only had, I think it was 2 plant employees, Fred Clark and...
Yeah, I mean, Fred was the staple. I think at that time you had Jerry Pace and Fred Clark, yourself, Bill, Sonny. I think that Willie Moore was one of the first female employees that you hired, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, and
Bill Emery.
And Marlene.
Yeah. Bill Emery. And Bill Emery was your purchasing guy. He came from Holmes, did he not?
I remember going downtown. Gerry had an El Camino, older El Camino, and you drove down. All the Toastlings were coming from the Holmes Company.
Yeah.
We were still using Toastlings from there. So as we were shipping wreckers, somebody was going down to the Holmes Company and picking up Toastlings.
From Mr. Welch, T100s.
Yeah.
Yep.
Willie McCurdy was the guy. In the plant
right.
that I was
Bootlegger. Yes.
trying to recall
Willie.
the name.
Yeah.
Yes.
He came from the Holmes Company
Yeah.
as a machinist.
Yeah.
He could do anything. If it was broke, he could fix it. Don't care what it was. Brilliant guy.
So as we moved away from the small, you or Century and the company itself, it started to find its place with just the 402. What was that vision or drive to step up to the 1030? How did that come about?
So this was to compete with the Holmes 750.
I mean, that's a pretty good jump going from 8 tons to a 1030 and putting that chassis on that Chevrolet chassis. And I remember going to the NTEA show in Indianapolis with you, Geoff, and that was the focal point. And I think that one trade show, the TBA, is really kind of gave you the kickstart to go into that full product line, which ended up off of the 1030. You did the 820, and then you came back with the 820 Express, and then you came back with the 925, and then
What was the 820 Express?
the 820 Express was basically you took a lot of the dollars out of the body and you kind of put a Home 600 body on the 820 boom and sill channels, and it was very competitive, with that mechanical product line, and it dropped a lot of weight.
Yeah, a single axle truck.
Yeah.
You remember a lot, I don't.
The tailboard on that 820 Express was actually a 402 tailboard, or the original design.
Right.
It was a standard with body standard floor plate on a larger subframe.
Yeah, may I see that top picture there?
That was a Super 6 or 6-pack.
Super 6.
So that was a single line. It was really made to compete with the 440. You had both a manual extension piece to it, or a manual elevation piece. Remember, you could pin it.
Oh, on this? No, that's just, I remember this one as a 401.
Well, you could.
401 had a hydraulic extend cylinder, and that one didn't. That was manual. You can't. There was a detent pin on the other side of the boom.
Yeah.
And you had to manually extend it out and pin it.
I don't remember this thing.
It was a big seller.
Yeah,
It was a big seller.
and the one with the manual elevation to get away the elevation cylinder.
You remember
We didn't
that?
sell very many. That was
No,
if you had the choice.
Had
That was
piece
it
that
was
would
too
come
hard
up, and
to-
you would take the cable back up there and raise the boom into position.
Yeah, I vaguely remember that.
yeah.
So the one thing that you did with the 1030 with the 1030 project is you went back and stiffened up the tailboard down after the first, I think it was 10 units or whatever, and you came back and did that tailboard on the 820, but it was heavy. So you came back and did the 820 Express, which was that tailboard Geoff was mentioning that you used off the 402.
Why would the tailboard, tailgate, we called them tailgate, you call them tailboard, why would, they were either made out of 1/4-inch plate or 3/8 plate.
Yep.
So what did the weight have to do with anything?
Well, you were a lot more elaborate with what was being done with diagonal jacks, which is kind of where you went, with that change from the original 1030.
Are you saying this was not 3/8 plate?
No, that could have been 3/8, but if you remember, Kelly McKnight went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 snatch blocks to the back of that tailboard and tore it off for you.
I remember that.
Yeah, I do.
But I do know that some operators could tear up anything.
Yeah, you're right. And but I mean, the 1040B and the Howard Koff 1040 with the diagonal rear spades, that was just to enhance the performance, get a wider stance. But of course, if you remember, you went to, sill channels in here, and it just added the weight, to that unit, and that's why this 820 Express just became what the Holmes 600 was, a very strong moneymaker and not a lot of weight to it to get it, the features and benefits.
Well, I'd forgotten about a lot of those variations.
And that was priced in line with the 600 in the marketplace.
Yep.
So we were competing still with old mindsets on the old mechanical wrecker, and obviously they've been manufacturing those for years and years and years, and the costing was
never
way
compete
down.
in price with the mechanical.
You got to remember that your investment of $300,000 or your inheritance of that in today's, I don't know how much that is. It doesn't sound like a lot of money, though it is in today's market. But, we were dealing with, when we did the 1040 to the 1040B, it was like an $11,000 savings, and that was huge for us to be able to compete with the Challenger product line, the Bill Bottoms and Geoff on that side of the game.
Or 1701.
Yes, and the Holmes now finally had come to hydraulics and took the Holmes 750 and do that. So that, that 1030 was really that, vision to create the Century product line and make it fully hydraulic and go from a 20 to 25 ton to the 30 to the 40. And eventually, your 1050 model that we did with Randy Nicola and that Ross Kinman kind of put it on that first chassis for us. And that was a power horse machine.
Well, none of this could have been done without the dedicated staff we had, all of you sitting here included. And I'm just proud to have been a part of it.
I can remember coming on board as a distributor for you in 1977 that I saw that postcard, that 4x6 postcard of that red and white Ford with the 402 on it, and it just looked professional. It as few as what Geoff was saying that was being made in the initial point to then to come by 1979 where you were building 100 units of those every month. That was an achievement in itself.
Well, that's one of the pictures I keep on my wall.
Yeah.
This one you're referring to, John?
Yes, sir. I got it's a Chevrolet. I made a mistake. Yeah. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Who did the drawings? Were you doing the drawings on the board, or was Jerry Pace doing those for the original?
Both of us. I was doing concepts, and Jerry Pace was doing details.
The details?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
From the 1030, really the next big thing that came to us was the time, if I'm not mistaken, I think you and Joe Story and the wives went to the United Kingdom and went to the Avro trade show.
Yeah.
And that was, like 81, somewhere in that range. And you were looking at coming up with the first hydraulic wheel lift to basically go away from the T100 or the Century 1212 toe sling. And the designing of automobiles was changing dramatically in the fact that no longer, because of the safety and the way they were designing the cars, could you pick up a vehicle from the front or the rear without damaging it unless you've gone to the wheel wells. That was the 1980 General Motors redesign, 80 through 82, was making these vehicles so on impact they would basically collapse, and therefore picking them up from the front or the rear bumper had to change. I think you went over there and you got a vision.
Well, I'm wondering now what gave me a vision over there.
I thought there was a tailgate lift for a box trailer that you had seen, because I have pictures that apparently you all looked at.
At Vulcan, we hadn't built anything that had a tailboard on it. We built the cradle snatcher.
Yeah.
And that was Dan Murray at GM was the driver.
The lift gates on trucks
Yeah.
gave me ideas.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, because I have a bunch of pictures that were hanging around in an old box.
Well, the Formula One and the tapered tailboard allowed you to be able to retract the axle towards the tailboard, reduce the overhang, give stability.
I remember when we did that,
At that point in time, a 60-inch CA was just about the only way that anybody saw the one-ton vehicles.
We sloped the deck
Yeah.
so we could tow it closer.
Yeah, because we had pictures usually of maybe towing a van and having the van pulled up so it was the back of the van was over the tailgate, and you could still steer with it.
Well, I mean,
Makes me want to buy one.
Well, it was a big change. We unveiled this product in April of 1983 down at the Court of Flags at the Orlando Trade Show. And at that point in time, it was a struggle for, the plant to even try to start to get the production up to meet the customer's demand. It was a big challenge in that 83 to 86, and putting that Formula One in.
We were building an add-on wheel lift at the same time too, to go back and retrofit, units,
Yes.
not only Century product, but other manufacturers' products. So we were building, a couple hundred of those at some point.
That was my first project when I came, was Gerry take the wheel lifts, because I remember him telling me that there were thousands of 440s, 480s, and 500s, and if we could put the wheel lift on those, we could sell them in kits. So that was my first project. So I did the Holmes series first, and then came back and did the Century. So that's one of the retrofit kits right there. And I was telling the owner of the truck, the driver of the truck, I said, I can look at the bolts on the back, and I can still in my mind see that bracket that goes on the back side
bolts
of the
in the tailboard to the frame.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
And we built those every month, just over and over and over for years.
Yeah. We built them both in a hydraulic version that would tap into the existing hydraulics with a retrofit valve on them.
Yeah.
And a 12-volt power pack for a mechanical that would go onto it.
Finished on.
Y'all are really bringing back things that I'd forgotten.
Yeah, no, but all of those things were, when we would have our sales meetings, no matter if they were here in Chattanooga, with the Choo Choo, or you took us down a couple times to Pier 66. I want to say at that particular time, Century was a sales-driven manufacturing facility.
Yeah.
And you had a tendency to listen to what was needed in the field, from what our challenges were through the reps to our job was then to support, of course, the distribution. And as we saw this vision of the Formula One taking place, that I was in Denver, Northern California, and Oregon. Basically, we were in a territory they might not be able to afford that brand new cab and chassis in Formula One at the time, and yet doing the WL300 and being able to adapt it over to an existing hydraulic or a Holmes mechanical record was a big market share.
WL300.
That was the add-on.
That was add-on wheel lift.
Yeah.
And the original WL300, if you recall, had a manual extension in it, and we were concerned about the impact on a longer overhang or a longer reach with a conventional toe sling. Mm-hmm. We didn't think the industry was ready to give up the toe sling, and within probably 18 months, the toe sling had almost been, they'd put it on the back of the truck and never used it, and we built a single extension. There was no pin in it.
Yeah. Well, there were some other issues with that extension that we had to overcome also.
Correct.
That's your WL300.
That was with the original.
That's the original one with the manual manual extension in it.
My goodness.
We also did a version that did the 11 and 1200 Holmes later on.
Yes. Yeah. Because of the narrow tailboard.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And it was much more difficult.
So basically, you had to go in there and open up the tailboard and, bolt that up underneath there. It wasn't a clean and nice job, but it basically got the gentleman into the wheel lift era, which is, when 83 was just a demand with the design of all the new automobiles.
What'd this sell for?
$3,000.
Yeah, $29.95.
Yeah. $3,000. Yeah.
Looks like a lot of stuff for $3,000.
And I remember Charlie Nobles brought a 440 down from Ohio for me to put the first prototype on. And it took a lot longer to do the prototype than I thought. And Charlie was very patient, but I was under the unit working on it, me and Tom Hare. And I remember Charlie pacing back and forth behind the truck while we were doing it. But it took almost a week to get that thing on there because we kept having issues and trying to figure out, okay, well, we didn't expect this because on the chassis is a lot different. That was the first project.
Well, didn't we have a dedicated wheel lift on the unit first?
Yes.
Before this?
Yes.
Yes.
So the Formula One came first, and then the demand to meet those people that couldn't justify that new cost. That's where we came up with the WL300.
If the upper arms were shorter than the lower arms in this thing, on this one, so that it would tilt, automatic tilt.
Yeah, that one still had, I think the original one still had where the bottom arms were still tied together with the pivot, the torque tube, I think on the original one. And then
This is all hydraulic.
But I was concerned about the parallel arms. Was wondering if they were of different length, top and bottom, so that it would start to tilt up a little as you raise it.
I don't remember that.
Well, the reason that was done was because if they were all four lengths the same length, it would come up all right, but the weight of the vehicle being lifted would cause the truck springs to compress and it would go down. So this was designed to create an uplift.
That changed when you went to the fully hydraulic version.
Yeah, and
That's right.
that
And we
was
put the hydraulic cylinders on the
Correct.
bottom.
And then you put a hydraulic tilt package on the bottom.
Right.
So
And you could get it either way. At first, you could buy it without the cylinder or with the cylinders.
right.
I think we called the first one auto tilt or something like that.
So I came in August of '83, and that was, like I say, was the first project. Did a few things before that, but just within weeks after I came, that was what I started on. And I remember Wayne Gibson took me around to a bunch of local people that had the old Holmes units, and so I could get familiar with what they looked like. And then a lot of it was from you guys, Jerry Pace and all of it, in memory of how the Holmes body was built. Okay, so this is how it's built. This is what you have to design around.
Well, how many of these did we sell?
We were selling 30 or 40 of those a month for a long time.
In '88, you were selling 150 a month.
Really? Okay.
You were selling more add-on wheel lifts than you were actually building production bodies.
Yeah.
Yeah, so whoever's idea, that was a good one. It filled a huge void. But like I said, the automobile industry had dramatically changed in the fact of the compression, the impact and the collapse of the front end and the rear end, on accident scenes from that 1974 when automobiles had those impact bumpers. They made them so rigid that caused more body injuries and that major accidents. And so in 80 or 83, all of the major manufacturers went to these impact over the wheel well areas to basically create that driver's envelope in the door. And that's kind of why we had to go to the T-hooks, way back up underneath the compartments as we changed to the means of being able to carry it. But the wheel lifts, that's just came on strong. I know that we had several major manufacturers that tried to imitate the Formula One. Basically, the Vulcan was on its own with the T75 and 76 models, with the cradle snatchers and being able to pick a vehicle up from 90 degrees, which was a neat part of it. But the
I
Formula
remember when the sales department was begging me to build a cradle snatcher. I thought, that thing is too clumsy. I can't see that. And that's, so that's why we came up with something different.
Yeah, in fact, when you came back from Europe, that was one of the conversations, because there had been some retrofits, both in the European and the Asian markets, that were cradle snatchers on, or the actual cradle on a hydraulic boom. The problem with that at the time, obviously, without the tapered tailboard, you had to keep the vehicle so far away that you had, all the load was on the rear wheels and very little steering weight on them.
You were able to tell Formula One salesmen by one noted things that was part of his apparel. Do you remember what that was?
No.
What was it? It was right here on the heel, because he would have to kick that L-arm out of the socket. Do you remember that? I think the next vision that you brought on was the aluminum car carrier. And the fact that so many of the car carriers that were currently out in the marketplace, load angle was not their vision. They basically just wanted to bring a vehicle up onto the deck, and therefore to be different. I know that there was a couple designs that Ralph, you worked on.
I didn't want to build a car carrier.
You didn't?
Did not.
No.
And who convinced you?
I suppose it was Sonny.
Yeah.
That he says, we just got to have a car carrier. I just did not want to get into that business because it just did not look like a wrecker. I didn't think it belonged in our line, but I was wrong.
Yeah.
At the time, Holmes wasn't even building car carriers. They were subbing Don Holler at Tick. Up in New York was building them, and they were rebranding them.
I think we were the last to get into it.
Close to it. But I remember that was my second project.
Yeah, but I said, well, if we're going to have to get into it, I want to build the best one out there.
And you said that every time that we would set up a distributorship, that they would come in after and say, okay, you have tow trucks. Why don't you take our carriers on this line, and now you have you have tow trucks and you have carriers. So you said they forced us into it. But you had, and John says aluminum, yes, the first concept we had was a solid sheet of aluminum. And I remember we had to have it shipped from Mount Washington State, best I remember. And we built one design. It was similar to one of our competitors. After we got it built, you said, and there's a couple of things I remember you saying, well, that's okay, but that's not what I want. Well, what do you want, Gerry? Well, I don't know. I just know I don't want that. So that's one. So that we ended up selling to a customer down in Dalton. He ran it, and then we started a second design. Before I finished the second design, you came back up and said, what if we do it this way? So we sort of scrapped the second design and went on with the third design. I was in the process of doing it and starting to sketch out and do. And then that's when we decided, okay, the market looks like it's not an aluminum sheet, it's extrusions, because the other people that we're competing against have extruded beds, extruded parts in their beds. So you wanted to go ahead and finish up the prototype I was working on, and we sat down and talked, and I finally convinced you, Gerry, let's just scrap what we have, because yes, we've already built some parts, but we know we don't want this. We know we don't want to continue with it. Let's just stop. Throw the parts away and start over again. Let's start with a new sheet and start working with extrusions, which was a major learning curve in itself, just the aluminum, and learning how to extrude those and get them straight, get them so the bed will snap together and work every time.
But from a user's point of view, that polished side rail was a game changer.
Yeah.
And you weren't using, at the time, people trying to keep aluminum clean were using acid washing and washing the side rails. You never did that, and you could do that with some of the other products out there because they were a dull finished aluminum to start off with.
Yeah.
They never got that with that aluminum.
The first one we did just a piece of angle aluminum. And then the second one we were trying to figure out, okay, what do we want to use for the rail? And I remember you came up one day and said, what if we take a piece of aluminum channel and we notch the edge, notch the back, and then bend that together and weld it. So we got the channel and we put it on the plasma machine one night and they burned the notch in there, and the next day we were going to bend it down. I got smart and I went out there in the shop that afternoon. I think it was a Friday afternoon.
You talking about back here?
Yes, that right there. So those were sticking out, and then we forced them down and tacked them and welded them. So I went out that afternoon and I was looking at that piece of channel and I thought, I wonder if I could bend that down. So I pushed on it and it sort of bent, but it didn't bend down. So I got up on it and I put my weight on it. And what I
That's
did.
not much weight at it, Ralph. You didn't weigh that much.
I didn't weigh that much, but it was enough weight that I felt something give in my side and it hurt. And I'm like, that didn't feel good. I went up and told Charla, well, I think I might have hurt myself. What, do you want to go to the doctor? No, I think I'll be okay. So I went home. Monday morning, the alarm clock went off and I started to get out of bed and it's like, oh God, that hurts. Took an x-ray, I'd broken 2 ribs.
Trying to push that extrusion
Trying to
down.
push that down,
Yeah.
so.
The same thing on that carrier, the approach plate was
Yeah,
far different than anything else. So everybody else was using a tapered, a broken piece of aluminum, that two-sided aluminum. The extrusion on the back was, far, far, far more durable than everything else that was out there.
well, we knew that we needed T-slots in there, keyhole slots, to tie everything down. So it needed to be heavier. So I had never designed an aluminum extrusion in my life, and that was my first, and it just...
The other piece of that is that we haven't talked about is the subframe in the carrier itself that mounted on top of the frame rail, as opposed to, a hinge plate on the very back piece and the cylinder side mounted on the frame. So
That was a sales pitch, basically similar to what we were doing. Is that it had its own subframe.
Yeah.
It was not depending. Those were the aluminum, the features that we offered in the aluminum extrusion, the mounting of it. But the number one thing was the load angle.
Yeah.
At 10.5 degrees is what put us in the market right out of the get-go. Remember, at that time, Landau had the centerfold.
Yeah.
And basically that was pivoting the Ford or Chevrolet cab and chassis in order to get them down to the
It's
angle.
pivoting off the rear axle because of the way it bent the truck.
And this way you did not interfere with that cab and chassis and that mounting angle, and that's therefore 1986, we were in the carrier business, whether you liked it or not.
Well, and Gerry would come up and he'd say, okay, what angle? We've got to be, we want to be able to load a Corvette and the air dam not drag. So it's got to be 10 degrees. So he'd come up and, okay, what's your load angle? Well, I'm not 10 degrees yet, Gerry. Well, keep working. And it was every day. It went on for weeks. And I was trying to figure out, okay, how can I get that angle down? Finally, if we extend the bed back a little bit more than anybody else does, I think it was 120 inches.
It was 120 inches exactly.
And we had to take the truck down to a tire dealer. And I remember Chris set it up for me somewhere off of Central Avenue, the best I remember. And I drove the truck down there and he put low profile tires on us, on the truck for us. And that was the last key that got us down. And we took it down to Newton Chevrolet. They had a brand new Corvette.
Yep.
And I remember we went down to take those pictures and you and Sonny came up and said, all right, it's a brand new Corvette. Don't you all hurt it, because if you do, we have to pay for any damage you do.
keep in mind the structure. You were putting them on F-350s and 30 series Chevrolets. The Super Duties hadn't come into the marketplace yet. So you're using a 10,000 GVW truck.
Right.
And this thing was, you could plug that carrier in. If you had a way to mount it on a floor and plug it in, It went to work. You didn't have to assemble it. You didn't have to. You weren't dependent on a whole bunch of different components on top of the truck frame.
And that was one of the other design criteria. He came up and said, I want this to be just like our tow truck. I want you to be able to pick that bed up and put it over completely assembled. I don't want you to get a box with cylinders and brackets and things. So you have to take all that out and assemble it on the truck. I want to be able to pick it up and put it over on the truck. So that was more of the design. And yes, we did it. We did it.
Yeah, so 1986, we go to the PWF show and at the Sheridan Twin Towers with that first car carrier, it meets the customer's demands. All of a sudden, we're in the carrier business, but 1 week later, we had to have that unit all the way across the country and be at California show. You remember that?
Not exactly, but it doesn't surprise me what you're telling me.
What Gerry was, the thing he was wanting to do is we think we can build 30 of these a month. Well, 30 a month went past that in a very short period of time.
Is it this unit?
Another, yes, that
unit right there. Yeah. We called that your $1 million baby.
It was, but we did some very innovative things. We had controls right and left side that no one else had. And while we were there trying to clean it, one of our competitors came over and they were crawling under our unit while I was trying to wax the unit, looking at the rods and all, and how we designed the dual controls. Like, come on, guys, don't be this obvious.
I had exactly the same thing happen out in Bend, Oregon. Had another manufacturer of the Northwest came into the trade show and in the middle of our booth, and he's down underneath notepad taking pictures and all the rest of that stuff. And I said, I'll be glad to park it outside afterwards if you want, but here's not the place. And his comment was, what are you afraid of? We're eating sandwiches and you're eating steak. And that
was that?
Sorry.
It was Ed Zakovich, who had been a Century dealer and went out on his own. The company was so innovative and was always the leader in innovation from its founding that the competitors all felt, engineering department at that point became a Polaroid camera and a Xerox machine,
Well, I remember not long after I started, I went in one Saturday. I think I was the only one in the engineering department. And the phone rang, and I picked the phone up, and it was Gerry. And Gerry said, Ralph, they're getting ready to deliver a package to you. So when FedEx comes, get the package. And he says, do you know how to get to my house? No. And he told me how to drive to his house. He said, would you bring that package to me? So FedEx comes, I get the package, I get in my car, and I drive up to Gerry's house. Turns out it's patent for the wheel lift. And he had sent you, to approve it and read it. So I remember I sat in your second living room, and you sat there in the chair and got it out and started reading. And all of a sudden you started cussing.
Was that for the Formula One?
It was for the Formula One.
You're talking about the patent?
Yes.
Patent application.
Yes, you were not very happy with the patent lawyer at that time, and you hurled the paperwork across the living room and says, thank you, you can go back to work now.
Well, that patent was critical for Century, because it did protect us for a while, with the L-arm and all.
Yeah.
Which we ended up using across the board. It was a chain in the end. It was a very unique time because there were so many changes that were coming out that we were forced to make moves on. And it was all in the design of the automobiles and the trucking industry. Really, the last thing that before your sale to the company in '88 was the envision to bring on the SDU, which was the Super Duty underlift. And we saw that subframe come with an individual design chain operated, which went into the power tilt system that you were mentioning with the Formula One as it elevated. And, the underlift didn't interfere with the recovery boom. And the one thing that you had, and what you'd listened to some of the other end users on it, was that height was a very critical thing on achieving that. And the design of the original SDU and how it traveled up with the Rabbit and the bearings and and went to the height that it did was a key selling point for us on that. You remember that?
I remember the rabbit.
Yeah.
I don't know why we ended up calling it that. But
Well, basically, probably because the rabbit ran around the Greyhound dog track. Whatever.
I think that's where it came
right.
from.
I think
It
you're
might have
right.
been that on there. But it was that next thing that now again we were bringing a brand new product, to an industry that had never seen that. The Europeans had underlifts for a while. We had seen the ECA and the Bros start to come into the American market in the early 80s. But the one thing about the European market is everything was cab overs. And everything in the States were, had a bonnet on it, were long nose. And therefore they didn't have the reach and they didn't have the power and they didn't have the extension power to run that load once elevated to come in and out. So once again, the Century came out with that 3-stage underlift and gave us that, 110 inches of hydraulic stroke and was allowing us to be able to pick that vehicle up and by the axle with the frame forks and extend it in and out under load. And, in 1986, again, the demand from the sales force was we need production. And each time there was always an expansion. How many expansions do you remember at 8503 that you were involved at the plant?
Expansion?
To the manufacturing square footage.
Oh, good grief! I don't know.
There were 2 before I came because you built the first expansion out and then built on the front of that.
Yeah.
And then when we designed the car carrier, we built on the first expansion to the back. And as soon as we moved in it, we realized we didn't have enough room because the carriers used a lot more room than tow trucks did. So that was the
I
first.
know the plant was a patchwork.
Yeah.
It was.
And then we went back another section from that.
There was probably 8 or 9 additions to 8503. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't, take bringing Dan Sebastian on and creating that manufacturing facility up in PA. That, relieved that it gave us a lot more to just building wreckers here in Ottawa. So of all of that, from the beginning of 1972 up to 1988, that was a dramatic change in the industry, and you were all one of the driving parts to that.
I had a lot of help.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, we had good guidance.
Well,
People that listened to the market and brought us the information from the end users.
Did you feel that you had reached a level of production that may have been one of the reasonings for you selling in 1988?
I guess I was tired of the recessions, the ups and downs of the market over the past 20 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, now I've got a good offer, they tell me. My accountant said it's a fair offer, good offer, and if you want to retire, that's be a good time to do it. So I did.
Your timing was very good because 1988, we've been rolling for like 8 years solid.
Yeah.
And it wasn't 2 years later.
90 and 91 were brutal.
That was brutal.
Yeah, absolutely brutal.
And you were floating around Fort Lauderdale in your boat, and we were up there struggling again.
I think I was age 55 at the time.
I remember you told me that you'd watch your dad wait too late, and by the time he retired, he couldn't enjoy retirement, and that you had your boats and your airplanes, and that you enjoyed that also, and
That's very true.
and you wanted to enjoy yourself.
I was fortunate to be able to do that.
Yeah.
But I enjoyed building the company and enjoyed the fellowship and that I had with all the people that worked for the company, and fortunately, some of us are still here to talk about it. And I'm happy for that.
I think, Gerry, in addition to your employees that are key in any event in their loyalty, you had a lot of very, very loyal distributors that were loyal to you for generations.
No question about it.
And you had a lot of very loyal end users that were generational in relationships. And I think the difference probably was, to talk to somebody at the old Holmes company, it was run by people that were, for the most part, were inaccessible. And certainly you and Sonny were more than accessible to any segment of the industry.
It was a big family. I mean, it was, people would, I'd go to a show and the end users would come up and we just talked. I mean, we were friends. I'm still friends with people that I've known for years and years. And it's family. Even our vendors, there are people out there that I've worked with so many years. We've raised our kids together. But yeah, there are people in the industry now that, Marty, for one, God, I have no idea how many years I've talked to that man. And it's...
Well, the towing and recovery industry, I always tell everyone that's not involved in it, is we are a breed of people that made this country great. From the late 1800s to the early 1900s, the mom and pa that had the grocery stores and the hardware and the haircut and the general store and the clothing store, those were all family-based businesses. And today, that's all corporate America. And with us we're dealing with second, third, and fourth generation towing and recovery people, successful entrepreneurs that are able to make a living. In '88, when you sold the company, it wasn't a couple years later that Bill Miller became involved. And just quickly, Bill acquired the Challenger company out of Elkhart, Indiana. And then 2 or 3 months later, it was the Holmes company out of Dyersburg. And really, Bill understood that without Century, he really had 2 major manufacturers, but really not the sales force. And that's when he, looked at Sonny Griffin and Geoff and said, in order to make these acquisitions complete, it had to get the Century distribution. September of 1990, now this individual from nowhere, Bill Miller, owned the 3 major manufacturers in the towing and recovery business and put them under that General Motors roof. He had a vision, and it was a good vision.
Ask Gerry something that you haven't asked him yet.
You still love your wife?
Don't answer, Gerry. Don't answer.
I adore my wife.
I can say that actually Betsy was always at your side and always very, very involved and very social with, again, customers and distributors. And you didn't go very far where she wasn't at your side all the time.
Well, she's a sweetheart. Still
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, Ottawa, do you remember what you paid for the property when you bought it?
I think it was 10 acres, $7,000, with a old pole barn building on it.
Before you sold the company, you had acquired more of the property up there, had you not?
Yes, yes, we had acquired, I think it was probably up to 40 acres, something like that.
I believe it was 36 acres.
Yeah.
Our water supply was a problem. We only had a 1 inch or a 3/4 inch lead pipe running down the road.
So what did the city make you do? They made you bring water up to the factory, did they not?
Well, we asked to have it brought,
Yeah.
and as I recall. And then we ran a main because they were going to build a subdivision up behind us anyway. So
The story that I'd heard that you end up having to bring the water to the manufacturing facility and then the city tapped into it and did the main didn't make you upset. It was part of the original plan. If they brought the larger water main up there, then that would supply 8503 and then this neighborhood they were going to build up there.
well, it supplied us all.
Yeah.
And I think that we were the ones that initially requested it.
Did you have to pay for it?
No.
You recognize those people?
I sure do.
Is that your mother and dad?
No, that's my aunt and her then husband,
Okay.
and that's Betsy and myself.
Yeah, and Betsy. That was in a stack of photographs, and
Wow.
I could not figure out who it was. There he is.
Looking at the back, the hill in the background, it was probably Daytona. The infield in Daytona.
All right, gentlemen. Well, Geoff, Ralph, really appreciate your time coming in here. Gerry, it's okay if I tell everybody that you're 91?
Sure.
You know, it's absolutely a pleasure. I do want to say that there's a whole industry out there that is thankful for your original vision. That point of 1972, seeing that you spent the next couple years and looking at that, stepping out on your own in 1974 and creating the Century Record Company, and your wife naming it Century in itself. And then the challenge itself to conquer that point of investing something that you believed in, because, you know, you brought a whole change to what was the industry of the past. I think timing was a unique thing in the fact that, you know, it was the era of hydraulics. We were challenged with the design of automotives and getting away from what had been done for 30, 40, 50 years on how we towed a vehicle. The birth of the car carrier, being able to handle more than one vehicle and going down the road. The large wrecker line today, which we see throughout the world in the military side, as well as being used in all corners of the world. I think what Henry Ford was to the auto industry, Gerry, you are what it is to the towing and recovery industry, because you brought everything out there that is currently in design and being used from all corners. You've supported a lot of us with your visions, from the design of that product line to where we are today, and you've impacted people from all corners. And if it hadn't been for your visions, we wouldn't be here today. I want to say personally that I thank you for myself, for those that aren't with us any longer, and I'm more than proud to represent the Century product line and what you gave us.
Well, thank you, John. I appreciate that very much. I failed to mention that my brother Bill Holmes also had the courage to bail out from the shelter of the Holmes Company and follow me
That vision
to Century, and enjoyed his friendship and his knowledge of the distributors, friendship with the distributors for about 5 years before Bill decided to take off on his own and into business for himself. But I didn't want to forget my brother Bill, who actually was one of the founders.
Bill was
the original Century Record.
Bill was very social.
Yes,
He was a character, to say the least, and we spent a lot of time together in the early Formula groups. And if I can just add to John's thing, thank you for allowing us all to be part of it.
Yes.
It really set all of our careers up. Here we are 50 years later, and we can go back and count the days in it and have never looked back.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for being with me. It's been a great run.
Yeah, I've just passed my 40th year, so it's been great. And I really appreciate the opportunity that you gave me.
Thank you, guys. How long is this going to go?
Oh, how long can you take it? You're sitting down.
I don't know what else we're going to talk about.
Well,
Miller Industries, the world leader in towing and recovery equipment.